So is Jesus just a curmudgeon? Did he have too much lemon juice with his vinegar for breakfast? Why is Jesus saying what he's saying to the woman? And as always with the scriptures, when you start diving into it and looking beyond the surface, there is so much more, and the story often turns out to be so different. So let's take a look at this. We'll do this in 3 parts. One is we'll look at this, where they are, the scene, then we'll look at Jesus, and then we'll look at the woman. So where are they? Where are they? Tyre and Sidon, yeah. So where are Tyre and Sidon today? They're in Lebanon. So Jesus is outside of the boundaries of Israel. He's in Gentile territory. So Jesus is up in Gentile territory, and he's got his disciples with him. Why does he have his disciples with him? Because Jesus is trying to get away with them to spend time explaining things to them, forming them, helping them to understand, and so on. Something that's somewhat akin to it is when perhaps you and your family, or just you and your husband or wife, want to get away somewhere, and we're shutting down the cell phone, we're shutting down everything, we're just going to go and get away from all this and take some time. And wouldn't you know, they find you. Yeah, they track you down. All those nice electronic devices, they're like electronic dog leashes for us. They track us wherever we are. So just when you're trying to have some time and downtime, so Jesus and his disciples are there, and here comes this interruption. So they're in this situation, and the disciples' response in all of this is to send her away. We don't want to have to deal with this nuisance. This woman is a nuisance. Now remember, also in Gentile territory, for the Jewish people, they looked down upon all the other people around them because they were the chosen people. You know, if you think about it for a minute, it's quite logical. If we're the chosen ones of God, then all the rest of these folks aren't quite up to snuff. And there was hostility that developed between all of them. So that's the scene. Jesus is up here, and this woman approaches him. So let's take a look at Jesus. When the woman first approaches him, how does Jesus respond? He doesn't say anything. And when they keep pushing, what does he say? My mission is to the people of Israel. So that's what you see. Jesus starts with the people of Israel. So what do we have next? But the woman comes back at him. And when you start looking at this whole exchange, what Jesus is doing is trying to find out, does she have real faith? And to get her to profess that. Because if you look at the life of Jesus, when Jesus is doing his public ministry, vast crowds come out to see him. Very few of them become followers of Jesus. And a lot of them are there because, hey, we're going out to see the show, or the miracles and the healings or whatever, the deliverances. And others show up and they treat Jesus like a drive-through Mr. Fix-It. You drive up, here's the thing, fix it. And when they've got that thing fixed, they just cruise on. Thanks, we'll remember you from time to time while we move on. So Jesus is looking at this, and Jesus responds to those people. And in this case, here comes the woman, and so he's trying to draw out from her a profession of faith of some sort, so that there's something that he can build on. So grace builds on nature. So what happens then is, how does she address him? This is very interesting when you start looking into the text. How does she address him? Lord, Son of David. Those are messianic terms for the Jewish people. So clearly this woman, she's heard about Jesus. She knows what Jesus is doing. She's approaching him. She's not just saying, Mr. Fix-It, fix it. She's addressing him in the terms that would be used for the Messiah. So, okay. But people can learn those things and say those things and have no meaning in their heart. And so Jesus pushes her a little further, and he uses the line about the dogs. Now, we hear that with our current attitudes, and we think, this is cruel and unusual or whatever else. But as so often is the case, when we judge from back there from our attitudes here without understanding, we can get ourselves into trouble or we miss what's really going on. So the Jewish people, if you go back and read the rabbinical writings, they had these idiomatic expressions for like the Samaritans, the Canaanites, and so on. And one of them was they were referred to as dogs. So what Jesus does, so he starts, what Jesus does in this is what he does throughout the gospel. He goes in their door and he comes out his door. And it's like these things where things get turned on their head. So Jesus comes, everything he's saying so far, the disciples are like, yeah, that's right. And so he uses this expression. And if we're thinking he's putting down the woman, look at the woman's response. Because the way she responds says something very different. So Jesus uses this expression. And what he's saying, again, in a different way, is my mission is to the house of Israel. And she's saying, but the message of God is for all people, Gentiles. And at that point, there's a wordplay that goes on. So Jesus uses the expression, she immediately comes back. So it's like, when we have little word plays teasing each other or jousting with each other, if you look at the original Greek language, that's what comes through that language. So she's calling him from the perspective of her faith. And at that point, Jesus is like, yes, this woman has real deep faith. And Jesus responds. And you see this frequently in the scriptures when Jesus is deeply moved, when people come to him and seek something from him. When Jesus, you get these different expressions, usually something like moved to the depths of his beings. The literal translation, Jesus was moved in his bowels, because the Jewish people believed that was the stomach was the place of the emotions. So Jesus is deeply moved at that point by this woman, her profession of faith in him, this Canaanite in a Gentile territory, and he immediately responds by healing and delivering her daughter from the demon. And we see that elsewhere in the scriptures. The Roman centurion, whose words we'll use just before communion. Lord, I'm not worthy that you come under my roof. Say only but the word, and my servant shall be healed. And Jesus says, nowhere in Israel have I found faith like this. And Jesus heals the centurion's servant like that. So the woman professes her faith through this exchange with Jesus. And Jesus responds, moved by her request. So let's take a look at the woman now. When you look at the woman, what are the things that she brings to the interaction with Jesus that so moves Jesus that he responds the way he does? So the first thing that she brings is great love. Great love for her daughter. Any of us here who are parents know what that means. You have a child, and there's a kind of love that comes out of you that's just so different. You'll sacrifice anything for this child. And that comes out clearly in this. And what that also says to Jesus when she approaches him is that this isn't for herself. This is for somebody that she loves deeply. It's a message to us in our culture today when we're all so self-absorbed. It's all about me, myself, and I. But here she comes, and this isn't for her, but this is for her daughter. The great love that she has. The second thing you see in the woman is her great faith. She's not deterred. She's not put off by the disciples saying, hey, this is our time, we'll get to you later kind of thing, we'll go away. You see this again in the Gospels. There's several instances of the gospel where Jesus is going by, people call out to Jesus, and people say, oh, be quiet or shut up or whatever. And Jesus hears them and he says, call them over. And they come over to Jesus, and Jesus either heals them or delivers them, or whatever happens, he does, because their calling out to him like that is like an act of faith. And so Jesus sees the great faith of this woman. She is persistent. She recognizes him, even as a Canaanite in Gentile territory. She recognizes him for who he is, the Messiah. And she professes faith in him. And every single little check that Jesus puts out there, she meets it and goes beyond. And what does Jesus say at the end? "O woman, great is your faith." And Jesus moves and acts. Another one is her persistence. She doesn't give up. Again, for those of you who are parents who have children, when your child, or not just parents, but people that we love are in dire straits, what do? We don't give up. We persist. We try. We want to do everything we can. Frankly, what's one of the most helpless feelings? Here's somebody you love deeply, and they've got something, and you cannot do anything to help them. Some of you may have experienced that with people you love who are dying of terminal diseases. And if every fiber in your being, you wish you could do something to help, but you can't. So her persistence is great at that moment, and she won't give up. And then the other thing, the final thing, there are other things we can look at in the woman. There's just a few for us to think about today, which I think also moves Jesus deeply. Her cheerfulness. She has a real magnanimity of heart. So that even through this exchange with Jesus, she's willing to verbally joust with him, or at least do this wordplay with him. And there's no bitterness that comes through her language or anything like that. She's firm, she has faith, she loves her daughter, but yet there's this cheerfulness, not woe is me or whatever, that comes through. And Jesus responds to that. What about you and I? We can look at the scriptures and say, oh, that's nice. I understand the scriptures a little more deeply now. That's great. But what about you and I? Because the scriptures are meant to be applied to our daily lives. What do we see in the scriptures? And I would hold up a couple of things in here. The way the woman approached Jesus, those 4 things to keep in mind for our own lives. But also how Jesus responds to her. With love, with mercy. And her daughter is healed. And God works that way in our lives. When we have a relationship with somebody and a relationship with God, a personal relationship, that changes how we approach the Lord and how he approaches us. And God does some very interesting things in these situations. You know, you have this sort of circuitous path for this woman, and then at the end, her daughter is set free and healed. Here's another example. This happened a few years ago. This was about a young man, he was 10 at the time, named Paul. Obviously, well, I won't give you the punchline at the end. But Paul, when he was about 9, started experiencing numbness in his waist and his legs. And so they lived in a small town. The doctors checked him out. Once they did all the stuff, it turns out he had a tumor growing on the bottom of his spine. And when they looked at it, the tumor was like an octopus with its tentacles wrapped in and around the spine. And the doctor said this is very dangerous to do any kind of surgery because we will probably end up causing paralysis from the waist down. What's the long-term prognosis? That this thing will cause paralysis from the waist down and he'll be a paraplegic. So they said, we'll try and take care of it with medications and all this other stuff, treatments. Well, it slowed it down, but it didn't stop it. So eventually it got to the point where they said, we're going to have to risk it and do surgery. And it's a very high-risk surgery because of the complications. So they were going to take him to a nearby city where they were going to have some expert doctor or whoever take care of this thing. But the family of the boy, who were members of the little Catholic parish in the town, they made his plight known and everyone was praying for him. And just before they went off to the big city, they had a little service there in the church where they anointed him and blessed him to go on his way. And word of his plight spread in the town. And all kinds of people were saying, we'll be praying for you and for the success of this. So he goes to the day of the surgery, and on that day they had a adoration in the little Catholic church there, praying for him. And the surgery, this is one of those 12-hour plus surgeries, because it is so intricate that you just make one mistake or one little shake, and you can cut a nerve or do all these things. So they went in, it was early morning for the surgery, they went in, and the boy's family was sitting out there just very, very anxious. Just before lunch, the doctor walks into the room and says, "We're done." And they were like, "But I thought this thing was going to go like another 7 or 8 hours." And the doctor said, "Yeah, I've never seen anything like this, but it's done, and I think it's successful. Your son is in the recovery room recovering, and from what we can see, he still has feeling in his legs and feet and waist." And so the father said, "Well, what happened?" And the doctor said, we opened him up, and we could see this tumor. And as we began to sort of slowly get hold of it and move it, it was like the whole thing just came loose. And all these strands that were wrapped around his spinal cord and everything just slid out. And the whole thing just came out. And we checked everything around him, around that area, and we couldn't find any trace of anything else. So we cleaned him up, and stitched him up, and he's in the recovery room. The doctors were just saying, "Never seen anything like it." So right there's a miracle. Now, it was a miracle that came through medical science, the hands of doctors, but the doctor saying, "I've never seen anything like it," that tells you there's something else in play here as well. So the boy recovered, and sometime later, he was talking to his father about the whole experience. And he said to his father, the boy understood that the Lord had healed him through that surgery. And he said, "Why did God wait to do that in the surgery when he could have healed me when you all started praying for me?" Good question. Why did God wait? And his father said to him, "You know Mr. Rue who lives down the street there?" The boy said, "Yeah." He said, "Mr. Rue was an atheist. And when he heard what you were going through, he began to pray. And Mr. Rue is still praying. And he's starting to come to the church." So we've got two miracles that the Lord did in that moment. By the way the miracle unfolded for the boy, who's now in his 20s. And then the way the Lord did the miracle brought this other man to faith, because he prayed for this boy and he saw the miracle. So the Lord works in these interesting ways in our lives. And you see in the gospel this morning how the Lord works in the life of this woman, but Jesus was also doing something else. He was reminding his disciples that his mission wasn't only to the people of Israel, but to the Gentiles as well. And in the end, that's where it almost all went, to the Gentiles. That's why we're here. Paul the apostle to the Gentiles, and so many of the others. So as we reflect on all this morning, let us firstly thank the Lord for his love and his mercy for you and I, and that he works in our lives in very interesting ways to bring about his greater glory. And let us also ask the Lord that we too would have the attitude of the woman: great faith, great love, great persistence, and great cheerfulness or magnanimity of heart as we live our lives of faith.